It's the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. We're going to be spending a little more time than usual on politics this week. We'll dedicate our entire middle segment to state politics as the Illinois General Assembly is coming to the end of its spring session. So let's talk now first about national politics. As always, we are joined by Linda Kenyon, who covers the Congress for Illinois Public Media. Linda, happy Friday. Good to have you on live with us today.
Well, happy Friday to you, and happier for those of us who are going to have a 3-day weekend.
Fantastic. All right, so let's start with the U.S. Postal Service. There's been a lot of pressure on the Postal Service from members of Congress lately. We've had several conversations on our show about the plans to change the structure of the Postal Service, eliminating mail processing in many Illinois cities. What have our elected representatives had to say about that?
Well, we had Senator Tammy Duckworth and the Senate Majority Whip, Dick Durbin, both featuring very prominently in the discussion about the proposed cuts to the U.S. Postal Service, cuts to service, especially in the Illinois area. And they spoke out against the proposed changes. They said it would exacerbate the already delayed mail delivery throughout the state of Illinois. And it turns out that Postmaster General Louis DeJoy has decided, well, maybe we should back off on those changes. So the processing and distribution centers in Illinois, no real overhauls there. And the senators had said that had there been major overhauls there, it would be a risk to the on-time mail service, especially in rural communities, and that it would put dozens of hardworking Illinoisans out of work. So a victory, if you will, but it is a temporary pause just through the end of this year. So Senators Durbin and Duckworth are saying, they're very happy to see that the proposed changes have been paused, but they will keep pushing to ensure that there will be robust, efficient, and reliable mail delivery accessible to all Illinoisans, and that it will be long-term, not short-lived.
This is a rare bipartisan issue, I think. We've seen some Republicans who have talked about, wanting to preserve this mail delivery. Do you get the sense, is the Postal Service sort of waiting and hoping that there's a Republican president and then they can go in a different direction? Or do you think this issue transcends that sort of thing?
I think this issue transcends that. I think everybody wants good mail delivery, that the nation depends on mail service, and perhaps in a different way than it used to in the past. But as the senators pointed out, people rely on it for their bills, their Social Security checks, life-saving prescription drugs, etc. And decimating service would really be a major setback, even though many of us use email, many of us pay our bills online, but there is still a vital need for the good old-fashioned U.S. mail, especially in rural areas.
I say, if we need to coordinate about when we're going to talk on the show next week, maybe I'll mail you a letter today, so I'm sure it gets there in time, so we can figure that out for the show. Or we could stick with
email.
Can
you imagine if we had to do it that way? We would never get anything done.
No, not in the era of radio. All right, I want to move to another subject, one that's a little more serious, and this is the controversy around the choice of flags that the Alito family is flying, or at least how they're flying them. There was the upside-down U.S. flag seen, just a story that just came out recently, although this happened after the January 6th riot or insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building. The family was flying their flag upside down, which was a symbol of distress, of course, at sea, but it also was closely associated with people who were in the so-called Stop the Steal notion. Then there was this other story this week about a Revolutionary War era flag, Appeal to Heaven. That was also seen multiple times at the insurrection. That was flying at the Alito's vacation home. This is Illinois news because one of the people who holds the levers of power on where this goes from here is our own senior Senator Dick Durbin, who heads the Senate Judiciary Committee. He has said the committee's investigating, but they're not holding public hearings. He also says Alito should recuse himself from the 2020 election cases, one of whom, of course, involves the former president. But I guess bigger picture here, what is the dialogue you're hearing around how this is playing out in Washington?
Well, there's a lot of uproar about it because the Supreme Court justices are supposed to be beyond reproach in terms of their ability to judge cases with objectivity and to have no political bias. And to have a Supreme Court justice such as Samuel Alito, who, by the way, blamed the flying of the upside down flag at his home on his wife, clearly knew about it. And also the other flag at his vacation home, that Appeal to Heaven flag, a symbol of Christian nationalists and members of the Stop the Steal movement, also known, by the way, as the pine tree flag, because it's just a pine tree, a green pine tree on a white background. It does show a certain political bias. Now, it becomes an even more complex issue when the January 6th insurrection case is supposed to come before the U.S. Supreme Court. It is on the docket. It is pending. And so to have Justice Alito express or his family express these political beliefs is considered very ripe grounds for recusal. Now, Supreme Court justices can recuse themselves from cases in which they may have a personal, connection. And Supreme Court justices have done that often in the past. But Justice Alito and also Justice Clarence Thomas, whose own considerations regarding the conservative movement have been called into question, have both said that they would not recuse themselves, that they can be objective jurists, and that there is no need for them to step aside. Now, on the other side, on the liberal justices, we've had Justice Elena Kagan, for example. She has recused herself on more than one occasion in cases that involved Harvard, because she once served on the board at Harvard. So she felt that, and she said that a justice should recuse themselves if there is even an appearance of impropriety or bias, and that is the best way to be a reliable and a good jurist on the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in the nation. Coupling that with the fact that Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. And so if one has a certain political bias or a perceived political bias, there's really nothing that can be done about that short of impeachment. And that's a very, very rare thing to do. It certainly has not happened often in U.S. history.
Just about a minute left. What do you think? I've seen calls on Twitter of people saying, what is Senator Durbin? Why isn't he holding, what is he doing? Why isn't he holding public hearings? Why isn't he being more loud and obnoxious about this, the way people on that site at least imagine Republicans would be if this was a liberal justice, say with a, blankety blanking Trump flag or something like that?
Yeah, there has been a lot of call about that. He was one of the leading senators who sent an open letter to Alito and to the court saying that that he should recuse himself. There were more than 30 members of Congress who did that on the Democratic side of the aisle. I suspect there will be more. But yes, there has been a comparison, and a lot of folks saying, look, if a liberal justice had done this, there would have been, banging on the walls to get them out of there. So why aren't they doing that with a Republican justice? Or if I should say a conservative justice. So I think that we have not seen the last of this, certainly because the January 6th case is pending before the Supreme Court, and because this is an election year and there will be various election challenges, there already are. We will probably see more action unfolding on this issue, and Senator Durbin, who is head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, will certainly be a very prominent figure.
All right. Well, you will be a prominent figure in our future coverage as well. Linda Kenyon, have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
More to come after a short break. This is the 21st show. Please stay with us. This is the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. Before we get into our next conversation, I do want to mention some of the future shows we're working on. Coming up Monday, it's Memorial Day. We are revisiting a conversation about the tens of thousands of Americans who have died in wars around the world and yet never received a proper burial. We're going to talk with a team that's helping to locate and identify their remains and the things they carried. That's coming up Monday on the program. I do also want to mention, we had taken a break from social media after, particularly Twitter, after Elon Musk labeled public media a government funded news service or something like that. Most of public radio took a break. We are beginning to reemerge and re engage with that platform as well as Threads. So if you want to seek us out there, 21st Show is our handle. We'd love to hear from you. It can be a great two-way conversation. Let us know what questions you want us to ask, what you want us to talk about, and we hope to see you online. All right, moving on with the show. Today was supposed to be the last day of the regular session for the Illinois legislature, the culmination of the mad rush to pass all sorts of bills, plus, of course, a budget. But as both chambers left for the day on Wednesday, it became clear that there were still sticking points in the budget among the Democrats who hold supermajorities. As we go to air on Friday morning, the word is that there is a budget agreement, though that will still take a couple of days to work its way through the chambers. Here to talk about that in our state politics portion of our political roundtable is Hannah Meisel with Capital News Illinois. Hannah, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian.
So from what you've heard, what are some of the highlights of the budget deal that's apparently been worked out?
Well, Governor J.B. Pritzker got most everything he wanted in terms of revenue enhancements he'd proposed in his February budget address. We're once again leaning into the cash cow that is gambling in Illinois. We'll see an increased tax on sports betting and video gaming terminals. Another big chunk of revenue will come from keeping in place the cap on how much businesses can claim as operating losses on their taxes. So this 10-year carry forward, and it was set to expire at the end of the year, though the cap will actually be raised from $100,000 to $500,000. And despite what one of the governor's top deputies had warned in a letter to state agency heads earlier this month, there won't be anywhere near $800 million in cuts to programs. We'll still be on track to spend $53 billion in the state budget this upcoming fiscal year.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. So I mentioned that there were some sticking points. Maybe that's understating it a little bit. Apparently, there were some really wide gaps. What's your read on how were those disagreements bridged? Right? What were the real holdups that has pushed session beyond the at least the scheduled deadline?
Well, it's a basic question of when we have bigger Democratic majorities than ever, especially in the House. I guess a couple of years ago we had one more Democrat in the Senate, but just enormous supermajorities, veto-proof supermajorities. Not that it really matters because you also have a Democrat in the governor's mansion. But not all Democrats are the same. You have extremely left-leaning progressives that have taken more and more power in these last few election cycles. And you still have more traditional, conservative Democrats who, they're clinging to their old ways, especially those who served with long, very powerful former House Speaker Mike Madigan, the way that he ran things. But, you had disagreement over things like hiking the tax on sports betting, which is still a nascent industry. Too nuanced to get into here, but some municipalities depend on the revenues more than others. Speaking of municipalities, a lot of them depend on distributions from the state's 1% tax on groceries, which the governor had also been pushing to eliminate. In the end, they'll still happen, but towns and cities will be essentially made whole from the loss. There's this tax on retailers, which is a bit too complicated to get into here on the radio. But stepping back, it's really a story about how Democrats, which I said, have larger majorities than ever, they don't like to be dictated to by the governor. We haven't had such a powerful governor in a really long time, going back to the 80s, Governor Jim Thompson, who had served many terms and established himself as this very good deal maker, but, wielded a lot of power. But Governor J.B. Pritzker, I think some Democrats resent the way that, he wields so much power, but at the same time, they know that sticking with him politically, like nationally, J.B. Pritzker's star is still rising. And they don't want to publicly disagree with him too much because they want to stick together as Democrats ultimately.
You know, there was an expression used about lower ranking or newer members of the legislature years ago that they were mushrooms, right? Because they were often kept in the dark and fed, well, things we can't talk about on the radio, I guess, the way it was said. But, you know, it's really changed. And that was the era, you and I covered this, when the Speaker Madigan, former Speaker Madigan, and the Senate President and the governor would get together and they'd work out the budget deal. And the members would be expected to fall in line. It really does seem more small d democratic these days, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Especially these newer progressive members, they have seen the way that government has worked in their lifetimes, and worked. They think that government doesn't work for, especially the marginalized people, the people with disabilities. All of these state programs that maybe they exist in name only, but the money isn't actually getting to where they need to be. You have also this attitude among some of the newer members that constituent services should come first, but that extends to how you wield your individual power in Springfield to get money to your district, to get projects going, to make sure that your local social services are adequately funded. It is definitely more small d democratic, but that means that you have more individual fiefdoms to contend with in a way that we haven't really seen before. It's very interesting.
And one thing we've barely mentioned here is Republicans, right? Other than the fact that they don't have supermajorities, have they been part of this budget making process at all?
No, not at all. They have been shut out. They haven't been an essential part of the budget making process, obviously, since Republican Governor Bruce Rauner was in office. But, in ways that we've also not seen before, the process is just so very, one-sided. Obviously, like you said, Republican members are smaller number than ever. But, this resentment grows and builds. And, I think Democrats are still in power, and that's why, they're not paying much attention to what Republicans complain about. But yeah, it's, if you live in a Republican district, you might, kind of chafe at the fact that it doesn't matter who is sitting in the seat that represents you, because they don't have any power when it comes to the budget.
Yeah. And even though I think it's worth noting that Republicans are in a super minority in the General Assembly, but that minority is smaller than maybe the actual number of Republicans in Illinois because of the way the supermajority Democrats drew the districts. A lot of the top level elections here for governor and president and senator are basically come down to about 55-40 Democrats to Republicans. But I believe, especially in the Senate, the number of Democrats is a higher percentage than that to the Republicans. So it really shut out even more than they might otherwise be. Let me take a moment to say this is the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. We're in the middle of our Friday Politics Roundtable, talking about the latest happenings in the Illinois General Assembly, what's happened so far, what hasn't happened. The legislature set a deadline of today to adjourn, but it did put a little hold on everyone's calendars and said it might go over, and it seems like it's going to at least go some into the weekend to finalize the budget and everything else they've been working on. We're talking about all of that with Hannah Meisel, a reporter with Capital News, Illinois. Hannah, let's turn to some of the other legislation that has gone through. One of those things is a change to the state's biometric data privacy law. The Supreme Court, respectfully suggested lawmakers clarify the law last year. Can you remind us what's the deal here and what they've done to clarify that?
That's right. So the biometric information privacy law goes all the way back to 2008, before, most of the technologies we now take for granted even existed. And that includes things like regular fingerprint scans, retinal scans, voice activation, it's called voice prints. Everyone has a unique voice that would be recognized by this sort of technology. And if you're a customer, you might have to give one of these things to activate an account, say, or if you're an employee of a place that uses, say, cash registers that need fingerprint activation to open, the cash drawer, this sort of thing says that if you didn't ask your customers or employees for their explicit permission, then you are on the hook maybe for $1,000 negligence fine, or even $5,000 if it was willful, which pretty much would never happen. But this Supreme Court case that you alluded to last winter, the Illinois Supreme Court, it was a case, White Castle, everyone's maybe least favorite burger chain.
Oh,
at least,
you're banned from the show forevermore, Hannah.
So sorry.
Okay, I digress. My apologies.
An employee had sued over, the collection of fingerprints, and they said, never got my permission. And the court did indeed find that every time the fingerprint was collected, it was a separate violation of the law. And the court didn't actually rule on whether it would, count up to whatever monetary amount. But White Castle was claiming that if they were on the hook, they'd be on the hook for $17 billion in damages. I should note that in the last, I think, month or so, 2 months, White Castle actually settled that case for $9 million with an M instead of $17 billion with a B. But nevertheless, the court had asked that the legislature clarified. And so at the urging of business groups, the legislature went back and said that it's the initial time that a fingerprint or any other biometric data is collected without permission. That's what would classify as one violation of the law. And it also for the companies to get permission via digital signatures, which actually can count for a few things.
All right, just maybe 4 minutes left in our time together. Can we talk about that big election law bill? They call this an omnibus bill that, among other things, would prohibit this group of websites that pretend to be straight news sites. They're known as pink slime sites. They're really more just sort of right-leaning propaganda or messaging. Some of them have been publishing the names, addresses, and birth dates of voters. It was really creeping people out. Apparently, this new law this legislation, if signed into law, would prohibit that. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, this bill popped out yesterday, so I confess I am not as familiar with it. I'm familiar with the situation in vague outlines, but these sites, maybe in the local Champaign, I think maybe it's called the Savannah Sun in the Champaign area, it's the Sangamon Sun in the Springfield area, and maybe 24 fake newspapers that have been distributed through the mail in these last 8 years now. When they were started, it was the data was collected by a political action committee, which is actually perfectly legal, but then the political action committee divested itself from these fake newspapers. And it seemed that the fake newspapers had used that data plus some other available data to kind of create an amalgamation, mashup list of these names and addresses that they had published. The Board of Elections earlier this spring had asked the Attorney General to get involved because the newspapers were not playing ball in the request to remove them because it was illegal for them to have it after having divested from the Political Action Committee. They basically said no, but then they did acquiesce eventually. But it's just very interesting to just zoom out on this issue that, more broadly, how do you have faith in local news if, some of these bad actors are posing as newspapers? It just gets very confusing for the average citizen and very disheartening.
Yeah, especially when real newspapers or traditional newspapers, however you want to phrase it, who, still hold themselves to standards of accountability and fairness and accuracy, are really suffering and have had massive staff cuts in recent decades. So, all right, just a couple of minutes left. We're coming to the end of our time. What is still up in the air? What are you going to be keeping an eye on in the coming hours, days? Goodness knows how long you all are going to be working there in the Capitol this weekend.
One of the stories I wanted to plug from one of our colleagues is this bill that had been several years of trying to eliminate the sub-minimum wage for folks with disabilities. Often what would happen in these closed shops is that you had special jobs for these folks with mostly intellectual disabilities, and they were being paid far less than the minimum wage based on their own productivity, which I just found pretty mind-blowing. And so there's been this push for several years to eliminate the sub-minimum wage for, just because advocates for people with disabilities thought that it was really insulting. But you also had the other side that said, like, we love employing these folks, but we can't afford to keep doing so if we have to pay more than the minimum wage. It's built into our business model, and this is the support for the community. But after many years of trying, there was an agreement reached, and that bill has passed the House, and we're sure to see it on the Senate floor probably today.
Interesting. Well, Hannah Meisel, I hope you get some rest after the end of this very long session. Thank you so much for making time to be with us today on the 21st Show.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'll have to take you out to White Castle soon. All right, more to come after a short break. This is the 21st Show. Stay with us.